This video was brought to you by Ground News. Superpower competition is all the rage at the moment. US foreign policy is myopically focused on containing China, and foreign policy journals are filled with sensationalist pieces predicting either China's imminent rise or its imminent demise. So in this video, we thought we'd try to do our best to give the outlines of this argument by looking at 3 reasons why China will overtake the US in the years to come. Now, before we get into it, and before you leave an angry comment about how biased this video is and how pro-China we are, we should probably say that we aren't arguing this ourselves. We're just presenting some of the more popular arguments. We actually did a companion video to this arguing the inverse over on the TLDR US channel. So you can go and watch that at the end of this video if you want some balance. Also, these 3 reasons aren't intended as an exhaustive list. There are obviously more than 3 possible arguments here. These are just the 3 that we thought were most significant. Also, obviously, which side of the argument you fall down on will depend on how you define a superpower, something we're not actually going to try and tackle or define in this video. Finally, we should say that we don't really want to be doing this kind of video. Ideally, the rise of China would be positive sum. It means a better economy and a higher standard of well-being for most Chinese people. It shouldn't be a zero-sum adversarial us versus them challenge to the US. Unfortunately, though, that's the way it's being framed in many parts of both Washington and Beijing. With that being said, let's get into it. The 3 reasons that we think that China will overtake the US are America's broken political system, China's upper hand in the green transition, and China's revamped diplomacy. Let's start with America's broken political system. In our companion video to this one, which we released over on the TLDR US channel, we argued that the CCP doesn't look quite as omniscient as they once did. That's because China's struggled to deflate their property bubble, flip-flopped on zero COVID, and scared off foreign businesses with sudden and savage regulatory crackdowns. And to make matters worse for China, America's political system actually looks pretty healthy. Trump and his election deniers, who presented arguably the biggest threat to America's political stability, fared pretty poorly in the midterms. Democrats and Republicans have finally found something they can agree on in Ukraine. And last year, Biden overcame Congress's legislative deadlock to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, which will arguably do more for the climate than any other individual piece of legislation. However, it's important to not overstate all of this. Even if it's healthier than it was, America's political system is still pretty broken. For instance, Trump has been replaced by Ron DeSantis, who's still an election skeptic, and who has a habit of promoting and supporting other election deniers. His politics are also pretty divisive in and of themselves, mostly focused on opposing what he describes as the woke left, and calling for massive tax cuts. Similarly, the bipartisan unity on Ukraine is already fraying. The Freedom Caucus of the House Republicans, who demonstrated their power by forcing House Speaker Kevin McCarthy to agree to a whole load of demands before they voted him in on the 15th, have insisted that not another penny will go to Ukraine. Even the Inflation Reduction Act, which was massively watered down compared to the original Build Back Better Act, was held up by one particularly stubborn senator in Joe Manchin, and it had to be disingenuously titled to even get through Congress. Similarly, even if the Chinese Communist Party don't look as omniscient as they once did, they're still probably better policymakers than Congress. Sure, they've struggled to deliberately bring down real estate prices, but at least they're trying to deflate their property bubble. Politicians in democracies, including in the US, are happy to continue inflating their property bubbles as long as it benefits their home-owning voters, even if it's clearly not a good idea. And sure, zero COVID has been a bit of a disaster, but it's not like the US's response to COVID, which killed over 1 million Americans and somehow became a partisan issue, was all that much better. And sure, the regulatory crackdowns have been sudden and unpredictable, but in many cases, they've been ahead of the curve. Take that crackdown on big tech companies last year. At the time, the West chided it as naive and anti-business, But Western politicians have become increasingly anxious about the influence of big tech over the last year or so. And now there are growing calls for more muscular regulation. So maybe the CCP aren't struggling as much as many people think, and maybe they're doing about as well as America is. Anyway, on to the second reason that China might become dominant in the future: the green transition. Historically, access to energy sources has been a necessary condition for superpower status. In the 19th century, when coal was the dominant energy source, the Europeans were superpowers, in part because they had lots of readily available coal. When oil became the dominant energy source in the 20th century, America's status as the world's largest oil producer helped it achieve and maintain its superpower status. In fact, America's oil continues to be a great source of revenue and confers great geopolitical security, because America doesn't have to rely on another country for its energy imports. So, in much the same way that the US benefited from the transition from coal to oil, China is well placed to benefit from the transition from oil to renewables. Shifting away from hydrocarbons will require building tons of green infrastructure. And this is good news for China, because China is the world's manufacturing superpower, and it dominates lots of these supply chains and industries. According to the latest IEA report, China accounts for the production of 90% of all rare earth elements, which are used in high-end technology, 80% of polysilicon, which is used in solar panel, and about 60% of all lithium, copper, nickel, and cobalt, all of which are used in battery production. China also dominates in bulk materials, producing more than half of the world's aluminium, iron, cement, and steel. And that's honestly why China produces at least a majority of literally every major component in solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries. And it's worth dwelling on this astonishing fact for a second. A single country produces half of every component required for the green transition. That means that China is on track to dominate the green energy era more than any previous energy superpower. For context, America, the world's largest oil producer, accounts for less than 20% of all oil produced globally. Now, America has realized this, and it is doing things to rearrange the green energy order. The Inflation Reduction Act, for example, introduces enormous subsidies for various green industries, which Biden hopes will encourage companies to shift their manufacturing to the US. However, America is still years behind China on this issue, and as impressive as the Inflation Reduction Act is, it's a rare piece of legislation from Congress, usually paralyzed by partisan infighting. Finally, the third reason for China's potential dominance is their revamped diplomacy. When we covered this topic back in 2021, we argued that China's aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy was one of the reasons that China would never overtake the US. While it might have played well domestically, China's wolf warrior diplomacy made China deeply unpopular abroad. However, since we made that video, Xi has apparently changed tact. Well-known wolf warriors have been demoted, and China has toned down the rhetoric across the board. And this approach already seems to be paying dividends. Just look at who's visited Beijing recently. As well as the usual suspects like former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev and the Pakistani Prime Minister, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and European Council President Charles Michel have visited the capital last year. And Xi and French President Emmanuel Macron had a chit-chat on the sidelines of the G20. So it's clear that the Western world is at least more receptive to this approach. On the other hand, while China is strengthening their diplomatic position, the permanent risk of an isolationist Republican in the White House has made even America's traditional allies wary of relying too heavily on the US. While NATO has been rejuvenated by the war in Ukraine, it's also inspired Europe to reduce their strategic reliance on America. Europe have also pushed back on America's us or them China policy, in part because they can't really afford to. As a result, the EU has so far resisted joining in with America's export controls on China, and the EU still insists that there's some space for cooperation. Other countries like India have also tried to avoid getting caught in the geopolitical crossfire, maintaining a steadfastly neutral stance between the US and China, despite the fact that, well, India doesn't get on all that well with China. Now, it's important not to overstate all of this. China and Xi are still deeply unpopular in the West, and America does still possess unparalleled soft power. But America's soft power does seem to be dwindling, and China's more moderate diplomacy is already paying dividends. So maybe they really are a challenger to America's long political dominance. And if that does happen, it will require a fundamental re-understanding of the global political world order. And if that kind of topic sounds interesting to you, then you might want to check out Ground News. They're a website and app which allow you to track global news, and importantly, actually compare how breaking news stories are being covered in different areas of the world. That's because they allow you to view global news stories from a diverse array of viewpoints, so that you can find out how international stories are being covered by news outlets on the ground or in neighboring countries. On top of that, for every story, you get bias, factuality, and ownership ratings for the news sources reporting on it. For example, I can quickly compare headlines from government-affiliated sources to get a sense of how governments, even democratically elected ones, can steer media coverage. And they also have several additions to make sure that you're getting the news which is most relevant in your region, including 4,000 news sources right here in the UK alone. Plus, if you want an even more customized experience, then you can follow specific people, places, or topics that interest you most, like politics, Europe, and the economy. It really is a fascinating way to read the news, and quite unlike any other news app out there. To give it a try, go to ground.news/TLDR Global. There you can subscribe to get unlimited access to all of their features and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. The link is in the description, and thank you for your support.